Hello and welcome to a top 50 edition of Addy Footy Fix on GeelongAdvertiser.com.au. My name is Nick Wade, and with me to discuss the Geelong Advertiser's top 50 and the Reader's top 20 is AFL historian, Geelong historian, statistics consultant. He's the man that knows everything about our game, Col Hutchinson. Col, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Nick.
Now, our top 50 was released last week and it gained a bit of airplay nationwide and generated, as you'd expect, a fair bit of debate. What were your overall impressions of the players in the top 50 and then, of course, our ordering of the players higher up and towards the top 20?
It's a challenging task, isn't it, to
Very
try
much.
to be conclusive with your judgment. But I don't think it was far out. There would perhaps be maybe half a dozen players that I would have considered should have been in.
Yep.
But then the difficult part is, who are the six that you leave out?
That's right. Who were those half a dozen players that you think were probably unlucky to miss in the top 50? Because we've had some people let us know that there were a few that we probably did miss.
Well, I think during the 1980s, where you had the situation of the two key defenders, Gary Malarkey and Jack Hawkins, when we had one of the really outstanding backlines in our history. I think they were two who should have been considered. Perhaps also a little bit later, you've got fellows like Tim McGrath and Brenton Sanderson, also defenders. Perhaps what sticks in our memory are the spectacular forwards with their goal-kicking feats, and sometimes the defenders are neglected a little bit.
They can be. Now, it's always tough to look back at particularly the eras that no one saw or no one we can ring up saw, particularly in the early days. You have to go a lot on historical references and statistics. What about players from, let's say, the pre-1950s, or were there players in those eras that we may have neglected?
Probably one would be Alec Eason. His brother Bill was listed prominently, but Alec was a real character as well as being an outstanding player as a rover, had a great sense of humour and was quite vigorous but also highly skilled, and he was probably one who was neglected. I think another one would probably be Peter Hardiman, who was the brother of Les, so it's ironic that we've got two brother combinations where one of the two was missed out in each case.
That's right. There were two that were really right on the cusp and caused a lot of debate. There was Russell Renfrey was one of those, and of course he played in the 23 straight wins in the 50s. And there was Billy Ryan as well, who was right on the edge. Now, in hindsight, should have we tried to maybe squeeze him in somewhere?
Oh yes, particularly Billy Ryan. I think he was regarded as probably the greatest mark that we ever had at the club, and one of the greatest in league football. It was very common for him to take a dozen to 20 marks, and half of them marks of the day.
Yeah, exactly. Now, enough of the players that we neglected. There was obviously a list of some champions who did make the cut. Now, the ordering is always a tough task because you are comparing eras against eras. How can we compare eras against eras? It's a tough one, isn't it?
It certainly is. What I'd love to do one day would be to go through all the print media from those early days and see how many times fellows like Jocker Todd were named in the best players. I know, for example, that Jack McMurray Sr., one of the great umpires of the 1930s, always regarded Jocker as the greatest player he ever umpired. Fantastic.
And you hear these sentiments from players who are in our top 20, players they'll regard as the best defender of their era, or Gordon Coventry said this about a certain player. Let's have a look at, say, our top 10, and going from 10 it was Billy Goggin, Doug Wade, George Todd, Reg Hickey, Bernie Smith, Ablett Jr., Gary Hocking, Matthew Scarlett, Polly Farmer, Gary Ablett Sr. A couple of modern day players, a couple of players from yesteryear, and a couple of players throughout the generations. What are your thoughts on the top 10 that we sort of devised over a week of debate?
What appealed to me about that was the variety of roles that those champions fulfilled. You've got a mixture of midfielders, defenders and forwards. So the temptation to heavily load the forwards was avoided, which was great.
Yep, there's a lot of stories about players like Jocker Todd, who no one really saw play that we could get in contact with, but he was a legend of his era, wasn't he?
He certainly was. And he actually started at the club as a great centre-half forward. And then a role of full-back was needed, so he was switched there and never looked back.
Yeah. Modern-day players, sometimes you can look too favourably on modern-day players, and sometimes you can go, oh, hang on, where do they really compare with the past greats? Now, of course, Geelong's era right now is arguably one of the most successful and the best in the club's history. How do we go about gauging the success of the modern day players against the greats of the 50s and the greats of the 30s and those who represented Geelong throughout 115 years of VFL history?
Well, I think consistency and longevity are two keys to that situation, and probably adaptability. Back in the early days, it wasn't very common for players to switch positions. Once they were established as a centre man, they tended to play out their career in that way. But there are others who were real standouts and who were able to adapt from forward line to back line or whatever.
Exactly. Now, our readers had their say, and they got to talk and have their votes on the top 20 players. Now, Cole, I don't know if you've still got the list there in your hands or whether I've got it buried under here somewhere, but there's a very, very heavy modern-day saturation in that list. But the top 10 is pretty consistent, and the players that we had as our top 3 remain their top 3. What are your thoughts on the top 20 that will appear in Thursday's Geelong Advertiser?
I don't think it's very far out at all. Our great mate Jocker is one that I definitely would have had in. But I think of the early players, we'd be struggling to find someone who has missed out who should be there. So I think the readers have been most observant and understanding of footy and particularly in the modern era.
Exactly, that's right. Now, Steve Johnson got a mention in there as well, Corey Enright. These are guys who, of course, Enright being a defender as well, is that modern-day attacking defender. When we look at, say, someone like a Matthew Scarlett, there was a lot of debate as to whether we got him too high. We sort of thought, well, he's a guy that's revolutionised that defensive role now, and he's no longer that dour stopper defender. He attacks the game. Is that the way you look at him? Would you have Scarlett as high as your top 5 in your all-time top 50?
Most certainly. Considering the champions that he's played on, I think a great example of this was last week against Collingwood, when on several occasions he was able to beat 3 opponents in a contest for the ball. Seemingly without effort, and then make the right decision once he had the ball.
Exactly.
And I think you were talking about the ability to change the way the game was played, particularly in defence. Another one who doesn't get enough credit with doing being revolutionary in that way was Ian Nankervis. He was the first backline player in football history who was actually tagged by an opponent.
It's incredible. Fantastic. And of course, we can't let a discussion about the greats of the game go by without talking about arguably the 2 best players in the club's history, Gary Ablett Sr. and Polly Farmer. Quickly, your thoughts on those guys?
Well, if we're talking about revolution in how football is played, or players having an influence in changing it, Polly is a standout there with the use of handball constructively and destructively as well. So there's no doubt that Polly was probably the greatest team player that Geelong ever had, as well as being the greatest ruckman. With Gary, his ability to excite people and to attract them to the game was just so magnificent. In the first half of his career, he wasn't always consistent. But if you analyse his game once he moved to full forward in 1993, there was no more consistent forward in the history of the game.
No, that's right. And one last thing, Joel Selwood was on 99 games. We had a criteria of 100 games for the top 50. That's just how it fell. Give Joel Selwood another 150 games, and where might he finish his career?
He could even finish number 1, It's how many poor games has he played? Maybe 3 if we were unlucky.
Yeah, when he was a little cub as an 18-year-old running around his first year maybe. No, he's had an outstanding career, hasn't he?
I would tend to think it was more a game where he was injured during the match and stayed on.
Yeah, exactly right. So that's going to be another great debate that we might have in another 5 or 10 years' time. Cole, thanks very much for joining us today on Addy Footy Fix Online. It's fantastic to catch up with you and chat about the Geelong Football Club. And good luck to the Cats this weekend against Carlton, and thanks for watching.